Hi everyone. Here's the slideshow for week 2, lesson 1. This is the only one we're going to have for this week. I think you've got a lot of material to go through with the readings, and then this particular slideshow, I will be uploading it as the PowerPoint presentation because it has some live links in it that I want you to be able to go to. So please make sure that you go through this entire slideshow and enjoy the links. They're going to provide a lot of additional information to you, not in terms of readings, but in terms of videos and podcasts and different things like that. I'll also be linking them to your primary page so you can easily have them for reference. So I already reviewed the term paper guidelines. That's provided in a separate article. And then in this one, I'm just going to be going through some of the readings briefly and then providing some historical context for you on some of the things that came up. All right. So in next week's agenda, I'll be posting an anonymous survey for you to respond to with regard to the class structure so far. Please be on the lookout for this. Also, if there is a structure in the class that's hindering your learning, please feel comfortable to talk with me privately so that we can brainstorm some solutions. I specifically indicated week 1 since we have had our video presentations or our Zoom meetings on week 1, and then with week 2 having a few more of the asynchronous presentations. So you'll be referencing both the Zoom meetings for the synchronous and then the asynchronous material. So just to provide some quick historical context as to what were the Wyatt standards. So these offered the right to treatment in the least restrictive environment, and those environments had to be humane, have qualified staff, and individual treatment plans. And your book talks about the importance of the Wyatt standards in jump-starting this idea about human ethics and treatment. For more information on this pivotal case, you can go to a video here that talks about the history of the Wyatt standards and what this case meant for individuals with disabilities. Also, more than once in the readings, the practice of electric shock is discussed. And I don't want to just glean over this. I hope it's something that you saw and kind of had a reaction to. And I wanted to be very forthright about this. Electric shock is something that has been practiced in the history of applied behavior analysis. I posted an article published earlier this year about the FDA finally banning the use of electric shock as a therapeutic mechanism. And I want to say again, this was earlier this year. The fact that the FDA banned it is monumental. This has been a long, ongoing fight, both from the side of self-advocates, people who advocate on behalf of individuals with disabilities, and the fight between people who think that this therapy offers some sort of beneficial outcome. So I've linked here a news release directly from the FDA. I also linked a news article, I believe it's from the New York Times, so I'm not sure everyone can access that, but this FDA one is definitely something that you can access. It's very, very, very interesting, and the reason why this is important in what we're talking about right now, one, because it has come up in your book, and also this is a practice derived from behavioral theory. So in fact, the Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis has published research on this. As you can see here, this is an article from 1990 talking about the clinical evaluation of the self-injurious behavior inhibiting system. And if you look in the abstract here, it talks about the use of a intervention that used electric shock, and it talked about the outcome, and it talked about it as a device. So you can look at this article if you would like. It's up to you. I have not linked the article. It was more just to show that this is real. This is something that is in our history of applied behavior analysis. And the reason why I'm spending some time talking about this is the FDA, what has gone on most recently, is specifically targeting a school that is founded on a behavior analytic principle. So this is the the Judge Rottenberg Educational Center, called JRC, in Canton, Massachusetts. And the FDA provision is specifically trying to get this school to stop using electric shock on their people who are residing at their facility. I was going to post a video about the JRC. There's some trailers, more like propaganda, commercials for them. And then there are the videos about the investigations that have gone on. They're hard to watch, and I didn't want to post them unless you wanted to watch them yourself. You can do so at your own risk. But here's a news article from NPR talking specifically about the use of electric shock treatments at JRC. So, in knowing this, most of you are working with and care about individuals who benefit from ABA services. It's a way to make real change, to address behaviors that impact students' academic social growth. I can tell you that for me, I enjoy the applied behavior analytic theory because it's data-driven, there is a heavy reliance on evidence-based practice, and it relies on objective interpretations versus subjective. And what that means is that I am not relying on what I think somebody else is thinking. I am relying on what somebody else is showing me and what is visible to my eye. I am trying to interpret as little as possible, using only what's the information that is being told to me, that is being shown to me, and that I can see in the environment. And I take meticulous data on it, and I make decisions based off that data, not just off of a hunch, not just off of an intuition. There's an element of clinical judgment in there, but by and large, I am functioning on objective data. However, there are significant errors of the past. ABA is a young field compared to fields like psychology that has a much deeper history, fields like medicine that has a much deeper history. This book specifically points out that errors of the past have plagued the field. However, the articles and the practices that I've shown you are more proximal than distal in time. In fact, they're not really even errors of the past. These are current practices. As you encounter others, you might find that the perception of ABA is not always great. People have very legitimate concern about the application of behavioral practices because of this and because of things that have happened so far. And also, there are other practices not as significant or as intense as electric shock therapy, but at times they're equally distressing practices in the name of behavioral therapy. So there have been recent concerns about things like planned ignoring of a child who's in distress. So we can talk more about this in our discussions. Also, the prohibition of self-stimulatory behaviors by some behavior analysts who feel that maybe they are making a difference by making the child not stand out as much. So not allowing them to have access to a self-stimulating behavior that regulates their emotions. There is some backlash on that now as people have started to come out and say, why did you take that from me? I am now facing these other issues because I wasn't allowed to stim. So those are things that we need to consider and think about. These are not errors of the past. These are encountering us now. And because ABA is so young, I think it's really, really important that we understand what our history entails and what we can do about it going forward. And also understand that people are going to have perceptions of our field that we don't share. Not because we are blind to the errors of the past or errors of current practice, but because we understand that there is merit in what we do, and why we do it is going to be how this is going to go forward. Again, going back to your value statement. So what do? Do we abandon the therapy? Do we change the name? Do we reform? Do we continue going forward doing these things? I say we do the best we can and going forward and doing better. So I'm more on the side of, if you want to call it reform, I just call it doing better. If anything, this should increase our reliance on adhering to ethical guidelines. We need to be above reproach. You guys are the next generation of practitioners getting out and setting a reputation for the field. So the onus is on you now to understand what are your ethical obligations. Why do these ethical obligations exist? How do you come to making a decision that maximally benefits the people that you are serving? And then if you do have to engage in something that causes distress or discomfort or risk, why are you doing it? It doesn't mean it's all bad. It just means that you have to have a very, very, very strong reason for doing these things in the name of therapy. As we talked about with the Sun Miami scandal, people were doing things without regard for that. And that created this massive issue. Of just substantial abuse. But abuse doesn't always have to be substantial to be impactful on a person's life. So we really, really, really want to make sure that we understand what we're doing. And if something doesn't feel right, then we need to understand and have a place to come back to. Okay, why doesn't this feel right, and how do I do better? So this is how I would suggest that you use your Bailey and Birch chapters. I had you read a lot of them, but they're somewhat short and they just go over the codes. So in using these chapters, they're really helpful in that they provide several ethical dilemmas with resolutions and additional information about the intent of each code. So you can rely on these. Like I said, I'll be posting the case studies in advance. So you can start to look in advance and see if you can triangulate from a code to a description to an example and a resolution. And you can see if you can identify what is the intent and interpretation of each code. And as we encounter ethical dilemmas, we are tasked with understanding the intent of ethical codes to ensure we are adhering to the guidelines from a position of competence rather than submission. And by that I mean, for example, with the gift-giving ethical guideline that we are not supposed to accept gifts. Now, we could take that at face value and say, I am never allowed to accept gifts. Now, that's a position of submission. I am told, therefore I do. However, when we understand the intent of the code is to keep us outside of the slippery slope of engaging in a multiple relationship. When we start to accept gifts, then we start to engage in a relationship that has a quid pro quo in addition to payment for service, and that can result in multiple relationships that then cloud our objectivity and cloud our ability to create a therapeutic environment for a person. So the intent of the code is to limit the possibility of developing a multiple relationship. Okay? So when coming back to the intent of the code, remember, the interpretation of the code is not always black and white. We can't always go with just submission. We can't always go with, this is what it says, therefore I do. We have to understand intent to give us a sense of why we are doing something. So coming from a position of competence. So going from that, carefully read the Broadhead article. Understand that he is referencing 2010 guidelines. So these are the previous guidelines to the 2014 ones that we are using right now. So the specific guideline he's talking about with the offering behavioral alternatives and the whole line of questioning, that is no longer in our current code of ethics. However, Code 6.0 has some language similar to the code referenced in Broadhead. I'm interested in your thoughts on this in your discussion questions. I have a specific discussion question on this. And again, coming back to that intent, what do you think is the intent behind the code referenced in the Broadhead article about offering behavioral alternatives? Why do you think it was changed? And what do you think is the intent behind the 6.0 code? Now, I'm not going to give you the answer to the last two questions because I think that's part of your discussion question. But I can tell you that first question, what I think is going on. So the intent, I believe, of the Broadhead article, though offering behavioral alternatives from that first set of guidelines, ABA has emerged in a time where psychological science has been very difficult to measure. So the reliance on subjective interpretations, and you can think about like psychodynamic theory. So Freud was someone who you could think about was very subjective in his interpretation, and he had this whole concept of human development that really did not have anything measurable and observable. It was just his interpretation. And behavior analysts wanted to challenge that and say, no, we can measure human behavior and create explanations through what we see, not by what we feel and what we're interpreting for them. And I think there's tremendous value behind that. Well, the concept of offering behavioral alternatives came out of this sense of, well, ours is better. This is a better way of measuring. So because somebody else is offering a non-behavioral alternative, ours is evidence-based, ours has this, data-based background, ours has experimental support, empirical support, so we're going to offer a behavioral alternative. However, that just made us look like not very much fun to work with, as you can imagine. Also, it's not very culturally competent. A lot of families, a lot of people, myself included, will do things because they make me feel good. And I would be really, really upset if someone told me, well, let me tell you in my interpretation what I think of that. It's like, well, that's great. I'm going to do it anyway. So the Broadhead article offers a really neat explanation. It offers a really neat flowchart for how to encounter this code, the code from 9.0 from the guidelines, and also 6.0. I think it's going to be relevant to that. And thinking through, well, when do we start to challenge, if we start to challenge that, what's an important thing to think through when we're talking to clients and they are using things that are not behavior analytic? How do I promote behavior analysis above all? Should I? Why should I? So again, those last two questions I want you to think about for yourself. But I think the Broadhead article, the intent behind offering behavioral alternatives is because at the time they believed that by offering something that had an evidence base and that had really grounded science was to the maximum benefit of the client. Not really thinking about the broader picture of that. Also, in the vein of challenging the status quo, I believe that Broadhead and the Horner articles are excellent examples of individuals and teams. Horner actually wrote this with a group of people, but individuals who have challenged the status quo. Rob Horner and colleagues articulated and addressed the concerns about aversive therapies. This was huge. Again, remembering the Sunland Miami scandal, and then you have Rob Horner coming out almost 20 years later and saying, hey, listen, we're still using aversive therapies. We are still relying on putting people in distress, putting people at risk, punishing people. We need to do something that is better, that is focused more on positive. And so he wrote the whole article about using non-aversive therapies, and that has become a whole branch of behavior analytic research called Positive Behaviors, Interventions, and Supports. I'm going to link another podcast from Rob Horner for you guys to listen to about the history of PBIS and how it came about. But this is, if you look at Code 4.08 now, that has become part of the ethical standard. Also, it has been written into IDEA. So really, when you're thinking about, oh my gosh, the code says this, and your value is telling you, but this might be better, think through that. Again, Rob Horner had a reason for it. He had a justification for it. And instead of conforming and submitting to whatever was present at the time, he pushed it further and said, no, we're going to do better. We're going to be better. And so he went forward with it. So again, don't let the errors of the past weigh you into a pattern that is going to go counter to your beliefs about do no harm, highest level of expectations for our clients, highest level of outcomes for them, person-centered. Push that and use ethical codes to justify doing the best for others, not just doing what we're told. So I think these are really, really great examples of that. And that's the end of this. So I hope you enjoyed the readings, and I hope you enjoy engaging with the discussion questions. Like I said, feel free to go through the links and I'll be posting the podcast for Rob Horner. And yeah, thank you so much. I look forward to seeing you all next weekend.